My name is Sasha Poquet, and I am a researcher at the Centre for Change and Complexity in Learning, or C3L, in Australia, Adelaide. And I'm presenting work that I'm personally very fond of. And this is a collaboration that I had with two people affiliated with the Centre for Research and Interdisciplinarity in Paris, France. I want to say a few words about my co-authors because besides being great scientists, they're also very engaged people. And so Luba Topikina, who works at Bell Labs and is a CRE affiliate, she also facilitates an NGO called Lecturers Without Borders. So you can see the Twitter handle there. And what this NGO does is it puts scientists in contact with high schools in different communities. So as scientists travel, or as scientists connect with high schools online, they can talk directly to the kids about the kind of work they do, which is a great way to reach out and sort of nurture next generation of scientists. So you can check out that NGO. And my second co-author, Mark Santolini, at the moment is very, very busy because he is co-facilitating this large infrastructure called Just One Giant Lab, that enables scientists from all over the world to participate in collaborative projects. And right now they've been running an open COVID-19 initiative. So just in the last several days, they had more than 700 people join their Slack channel, and there's a lot of collaborative activity. There's also a Twitter handle for the NGO, and they're really inviting anybody who wants to contribute to very great range of projects. So these are my co-authors, and I'm now on to the paper. So the paper is called Forum Networks, Social Networks, and the rationale for looking at forum networks is primarily because learners communicate using technology in all sorts of media. We know that we see people talk on Twitter, on Slack, on Stack Overflow, there are Moodle forums, there are edX forums, there are Reddit forums. Discussion bulletin boards, they have existed for a long time, and ultimately, although the technology affordances vary, the data that we get as analysts is very similar. We have timestamps, we have texts, we have indication of who spoke, and sometimes we have some indication as to who spoke to whom, but that's also varies. And so if you are like myself, you have seen some of the networks in forums in university courses. So for the last 2 years, I've been trying to address this problem, which I think is quite important for the learning analytics community, and that is, if you have all these beautiful courses, beautiful networks of how people interact, what kind of insight can we derive from these networks? And so in learning analytics, we ask questions like, or we would like to ask questions like, which of these networks indicates that there's better social learning or better social interaction, or which of these networks garners learner community? And we want to know these things because ultimately we want to understand which of these courses have pedagogies that enable this great social learning or that enables the social interactions of communities. And of course, there is a lot of negotiation with stakeholders like instructors and administrators and learners as to what actually counts as social learning and social interactions and community. But let's say we have those outcomes defined and negotiated. And then at the end of the day, when we want to understand which pedagogical interventions produce these better network structures, we're going to have to solve a very simple analytical problem. Well, not so simple, but an analytical problem, which is, how does this structure compare to this structure? And this is not a trivial problem, because although we like to do that in learning analytics at times, but this course K network is not actually comparable to course G network or course C network. Ultimately, there are 3 different instances of, and they are like apple and oranges, in fact. And so in order to compare a network to another network, we need to understand whether the structures that we observe in a given network occur there beyond chance. And to do so, what we would need to do is to take each of these observations, so for instance, a network in course G7, and produce a random distribution of networks of the same kind. So we need to know what is this kind of network and how to model that in order to produce a random distribution to which we can then compare this particular network to understand its structure. And so null models is one approach to generating this distribution of networks to compare the observed ones to. And ultimately null models is just a way of theorizing why we as researchers believe these networks form. So what are the mechanisms that drive the formation of the form networks? By having these mechanisms in place as a model, we can then generate a random network and compare it to the observed one. And so conventionally, in my own work and in work of others, we've applied quite often what's called exponential random graph modeling. And so I'm going to illustrate this conventional way of how we've done it so far, because it's similar to what we would do in ergoms, but it's not necessarily tied to ergoms only. So here we look at the social modeling. We have a network, we have a discussion forum. User A, user B replies to user A, user C replies to user B, etc. So these are just discussion forum threads. What we often do is we then create a projection from this discussion thread that aggregates these posts into learner-to-learner relationships. So we see relationships between the four learners, and then in order to understand whether this structure is something that we observe beyond chance, we randomize the ties or apply some other null model to produce a random projection of the observed projection between learners. So a simple example, let's say here in the observed projection, we see this learner C and we think it's a teacher, and this teacher gets a lot of replies from students, and we think that that's why this network forms. It's one of the parts of how we think this network comes to life. And so then we generate a distribution of random networks where we control for this propensity of this node to receive ties, and we actually see that in fact random projections don't have so at random node C wouldn't receive that many ties, so our hypothesis was true. That's sort of in a nutshell what ergoms do, how we evaluate our hypothesis about why or about the structures in forum networks in ergoms. The key to understanding this paper and the key to understanding the insight from this paper, which personally to me, and I've done analysis of network forums for a while, is to understand that when we produce random networks to understand observed structures, we randomize or we apply null models to relationships between the learners. And the question that we ask here is it a solid theoretical foundation to assume that human-to-human interactions actually are the mechanisms for how learner networks form in socio-technical environment? So instead, we examine another mechanism, which we argue is more baseline to how it's a lower level, so to speak, generative mechanism, which is posting behavior. So we explore the role of posting behavior in the formation of learner networks from online discussions. To explore the impact that learner posting has on network formation, we ask three rather simple questions. So how different is posting across courses? How much posting activity explains learner-to-learner networks? And what individual node level learner metrics are product of posting behavior and which are not? Ultimately, what we do in the paper is that we look as to what extent individual learner posting behavior can explain the network structure of learner-to-learner relationships and the metrics that we associate with that structure. And so this is the approach that we suggest in a paper, and we explore the insights based on that. Instead of doing the social modeling or modeling of social relations, we suggest to take one step back and treat forum as something that gathers posts and posting behaviors. And so then we apply our null models as or our hypothesis as to how forums come together to the actual discussion threads. What that means is that instead of building learner networks, we build post networks, and we produce random distributions of post networks, and then we create learner-to-learner random projections from the post networks. And it will become clearer as I go along, but just a few words about the methodology. So as I said before, we start with building networks of posts or posting activity from the discussion threads. And so we built two instances where we built one post-to-post networks and also student-to-thread networks, because there is no reason to believe that either is a better representation of posting behavior. And then we create null models. In other words, we randomize each of these networks in different manner. So in one set of null models, we only control for the activity in the network. What it means is that we basically take the post-to-post network and we just shuffle all the ties. So we don't know which post will connect to which post. And at the end, we have distributions of networks with randomly connected posts. The second type of null models we applied controls for topology. So we don't only fix the number of ties that we shuffle, but we also fix the number of replies that a post, not a learner, but a post receives. And so then by applying these two null models, here we randomize the ties between the different posts in forums, and after that, and only after that, we produce the learner-to-learner network as a random projection. And what we've done then empirically is we compared the learner-to-learner networks that were produced by null models with the actual learner-to-learner projections. And we want to compare whether the projections of relationships between learners would be similar or different from the ones we produced using our approach. And so I'm going to go over the results right now. And if you remember, the first research question was, does the posting behavior differ across the different courses, right? I have 20 courses, and the posting behavior is highly heterogeneous. So we have differences in the number of replies, we have differences in the number of posts on forums, and we have differences in the number of posts per thread. So there is no reason to say that all these courses are very similar. In fact, they are not. They are similar in the disciplines, they have been taught in the same department, but the posting behavior is highly heterogeneous. However, the second research question, where we compared observed learner-learner relations with random learner-learner relations produced through randomizing ties between posts, show that there is a lot of similarity between what we produced at random and with what was observed. And so this is very surprising because we're not, to remind you, we're not randomizing learner-to-learner relationships, we're just randomizing post-to-post relationships, but then we produce networks between learners that at random look very similar to the ones that happen. So for instance, when we compare the number of communities, density, and degree Gini, which is just a measure of centralization in the network, in networks of learners produced by chance and observed, we show that at least one of the null models that we used, and we have 6, they slightly vary, at least one of those 6 predicts a random graph well, this metric on the predicted graph, basically on the random graph, is the same as it is on the observed graph. In other words, our null models are very explanatory of the observed learner-to-learner structures. And more interestingly, once we have calculated centrality measures at the learner level, so degree and weighted degree and subgraph centrality and BERT constraints and clustering coefficient and weighted clustering coefficients in learner-to-learner networks, observed networks, and random networks, and then we calculate spearman correlation between the two, we show that the strength, the weighted degree and the plain degree correlate really well in the observed networks with the random networks. However, measures that refer to clustering, so triadic measures, are less explained by the nulls. Now, what does this all mean? It shows that when we randomize posting relationships, another way, when we control for the posting property at the level of the learner, we produce a communication structure between people in a forum that's very much like what happens in real world. The implication of this for learning analytics is that it is individual learner properties, so the way they say something in their post, as well as course design that prompts them to post as individuals, is what produces the interaction structures that we observed in these 20 courses to a large extent. And to me, this was very shocking because this changes the entire way of how one can understand the unfolding of the dynamics of the forums. So I'm going to list the implications. What it shows, what this simple experiment with really simplistic and trivial null models, I mean, they are really far from what we should be hypothesizing about, but even these simplistic null models show that posting behavior is very important to how forums come together, which means that posting or number of posts and weights of ties should be explicit in modeling. You can check how often, myself included, I have included number of posts per learner in modeling networks, and it wouldn't be very often, so that is a large error. You can also question to which extent using learner degree in a communication network, so the number of people you spoke to, actually is a social learning outcome or an outcome of an individual behavior of posting that is a proxy for learner competency to engage with others or learner motivation to engage in others. Because we show that just controlling for the properties of what one says produces the degree. So again, it goes back to there's something about the course design, there's something about what the learner is able to do, but that is not something about structurally what unfolds in a group, at least not for the degree metric and not in this data set of 20 courses. It also opens all sorts of opportunities for really meaningful null models, such as using linguistic proxies. So what is it about the post that can predict and show the importance of what mechanisms attract learners to reply to it? Because that seems, or sort of the study suggests that it is the discourse of the post that drives the attachment of ties, and hence then as a second order result, learner to learner relationships. The paper offers a methodological pipeline of how we can go about it. But finally, what is most important to me, and that is something that may not come through very much in this paper because it's more of a methodological paper, but it does come through once you pick this and start trying to evaluate the design of the courses, is that what we really can start doing is modeling forum as multi-level processes. So let me explain this a little bit. What it means is that we're not saying in this paper that forums are only function of posting behavior. I think what the results suggest is that they are to a large extent a product of posting behavior, but there are some social processes that evolve afterwards. And so we can say that there is a level of posting, and then there's a level of communication, and we can also argue there's a level of social relationships and emergent, and these are three different levels, and once we start considering them separately within the same course, we can use the posting null models to climb all the way up to meaningfully interpret what the social relationships may look like, what communication relationships may look like. So this is, to me, was a very important way of looking at the forums again and reassessing how we conceptualize the fundamental processes and mechanisms of how learners interact with one another and how can we meaningfully interpret the structures that we observe. I am going to stop talking. The version of this paper has, you can look the paper up. There's a lot of technical details in it, but I'd much rather make sure that through the questions I discuss more of a high-level contribution here, if that suits, but happy to talk technical stuff as well.